Ladies and gentlemen, hit subscribe to this channel right now. Your super chat is greatly appreciated. ABC News, judge in Trump's interference case grants extension sought by special counsel. NBC News, judge grants special counsel request to delay next steps in Trump case. Then we have Jack Smith seeks delay. This is another article to assess how SCOTUS ruling changes the January case. It completely destroys the case. Now you have Smith asking for an extension. That case will not have a trial in the next 2 months. The whole thing was predicated upon the absurd notion that Trump committed a crime with a speech. We found out that for official acts, it is unconstitutional to try to imprison a president because of a speech. Say that 20 times or 30 times. You can't imprison a president because of a speech. Okay, sorry, wonderful, morally superior, highly educated liberal Democrats. Such good people. Definitely against authoritarian, totalitarian tactics as they try to imprison Trump right before November 5th. But, like I said, the Supreme Court gave a huge victory to Trump. This does not allow him to take the life of a rival. That is a very stupid and foolish way of seeing things. It's actually completely unconstitutional and is not allowed by the latest Supreme Court ruling. Taking the life of another person by the president would not be an official act. It would be a blatant crime. What Trump was accused of was not a blatant crime. They used a very broad, vague, ambiguous statute that depended upon his intent. It was the 18 U.S. Code 371 statute, which is virtually impossible to prove in the circumstances that Trump found himself in, giving a speech, and then after the speech, something that took place, criminal activity that had literally nothing to do with his speech. The man said, go peacefully. Anyway, the Supreme Court, like I said, gave him presidential immunity. Supreme Court already ruled on this with Nixon v. Fitzgerald giving civil immunity. Now we have immunity from certain very broad, vague, ambiguous legal statutes like the Democrats tried to use. Anyway, all of this, you see that Harris is up or, gaining steam, maybe up in an aggregate of polls. That's actually a good thing in a way, because the more she's up, the worse I shouldn't say a good thing. You'll hear now the economy is on thin ice. The future of November 5th depends on the stock market and the U.S. economy, which unfortunately, I think late September, early October, or sometime in October before November, we will have, unfortunately, a stock market crash. Maybe earlier than that. But hit subscribe to this channel, people. Let's get started. Your super chat is greatly appreciated.
Markets ended another wild week as stocks whipsawed through sell-offs and rallies fueled by mixed expectations over a looming recession. After the major 1,000-point decline on Monday, the S&P 500 logged its best day since November 2022 on Thursday. Joining me right now to walk us through it is Slate Stone Wealth Chief Market Strategist Kenny Polcari. Kenny, great to see you. You always give a recipe in your market notes, and your latest recipe is for a martini. Are these markets driving you to drink?
They absolutely are. Listen, the volatility that we saw on Monday certainly started by the Japanese carry trade. It had to happen. There had to be some catalyst that was going to ignite that fire. We've all been talking about it. Valuations have gotten way stretched, not only in technology, but in some other parts of the market. And so we needed something. That just happened to ignite the fire, and then it created chaos and panic. And then, as we know, algos jump in, and then they start just selling stock. They rush out the door, tripping over each other, trying to sell stock, and so it causes that volatility. And then the whipsaw up, the whipsaw down, the whipsaw up on Thursday really was quite dramatic. So I don't think investors need to worry so much that this is the end. It's not. I think there is going to be continued volatility as we move through September and October, which is a seasonably weak time of year anyway in the markets, and people.
This man is more intelligent, knows probably a lot more about the markets and economics and finance and stocks than I do, investing than I do, probably a great deal wealthier than I am. I respectfully disagree with him. I think it's the end is very close, unfortunately, because of mismanagement for 4 years. But there's really good analysis here.
People should understand that.
All right, so talk to me about inflation in this upcoming week. We've got PPI out on Tuesday. We've got CPI out on Wednesday. Will these be big market movers? What should we be focused on to that end in terms of slowdown?
Well, I think they're actually both expected to come in a tenth of a percent better than last month, right? So everyone's going to make a big deal about that and say, oh, look, we got inflation down. But then this whole idea, like we saw earlier in the week, that there had to be an emergency Fed meeting and, oh, my God, we're going off the edge. I think that will certainly calm those fears down. I don't think we're going off the edge at all. I think if we get that better than expected CPI and PPI, it will just reinforce the idea that, in fact, the Fed is right in taking their time and monitoring it and not reacting or overreacting and becoming so emotional. So I do expect that those numbers are going to be better. I do expect that that's also going to help us put a floor and maybe calm this volatility down. But I still don't think it's over in terms of the trend in the market over the next couple of months.
So how do you want to allocate capital here, Kenny? I mean, I don't know.
So that's a more positive viewpoint. I think that what we've seen, we can't unsee. We have high inflation, high interest rates. Corporate profits are not going to continually be as high or grow as fast. And once we enter a recession, then we have a bear market. Then we have corporate profits declining substantially. And if they decline to where they were a year and a half, 2 years ago, then we get the same stock prices or worse, which is like a 20% decline. 2 years ago, it was 20% lower than it was today.
Let's move on to this. Kamala Harris claims it's her day one priority to lower costs if she's elected president. But why wait? Why not do it now? She could help do that. She's been vice president for 3 years. Joining us now, Committee to Unleash Prosperity co-founder Steve Moore. Steve, it's always great to have you on the program. All of a sudden now she's running for president and she's worried about inflation. But the last 3.5 years, while people are suffering, no one seemed to really care, especially when we spiked up to that 9% mark. I mean, ultimately, I look at her and I just feel like she's the teacher in Charlie Brown. It's just like what comes out. It's like you can't even understand it.
Well, let's talk about that inflation issue, because if you look at the Trump years, you know, the average inflation rate for the 4 years he was in office was 1.9%. We're actually below the Fed target for inflation. That's a pretty darn good record.
Isn't that amazing? We had less than 2% inflation with Trump, even before his last year in office, when Democrats shut down economic activity and then forced Trump to sign stimulus checks and then pretended inflation didn't exist, then flooded the country full of strategic petroleum reserves, then raised interest rates through the roof, and then ousted Biden. And now we have Harris, who, by the way, barely defeated Andrew Yang and didn't make the... She was 1 point ahead of Andrew Yang at one point. I think she only had like 5% support in the Democratic primary, didn't make the Democratic primary.
The Biden people come in when the inflation rate was 1.5%, and in 18 months, Kamala Harris and Joe Biden took that inflation rate to 9.1%. And by the way, that didn't happen by accident. It's important for people to connect the dots here. It happened because they launched a $4 trillion spending spree. Now, look, I think Trump's probably spent too much money at the end of COVID as well, but all of that massive government spending.
I love Steve Moore. He's awesome, and he's, probably has a far greater grasp of the economy than I do, but I know a thing or two about the economy and about the market, but mainly I know a thing or two about politics. And when anyone says, and I love Steve Moore, but when anyone says that, well, he spent too much, Trump didn't spend too much his last year. What was he supposed to do? Democratic governors, blue state governors, media bureaucrats who shall remain nameless said, shut down the economy. And so they literally prevented people from working, which was the worst thing you could ever have done at that moment, because it set the stage for trillions in stimulus and then the eventual the eventual inflation. What was the fuel for this? It wasn't just the calamity. Oh, well, the calamity. It's the calamity. The calamity. The calamity was not a human being. It was not. It was not a Fed chairman. It wasn't a politician. It wasn't a Democrat or journalist pushing to shut down state activity. The calamity was not sentient. The calamity did not have a cognitive or sentient ability to communicate, similar to our current president. The calamity involved, which we won't say, in Trump's last year in office, did not tell anyone to do anything. It was human beings who decided to shut down economic activity. Those human beings were overwhelmingly on the left. And if anything, it was like 5 or 6 red state governors that held out and like partially shut down for a second, and then, but it was Democrats who were the fuel to shut down economic activity and then force Trump. What was Trump supposed to do? People literally cannot work. They can't get a paycheck. So what do you think he would? You think that would be good if he vetoed? If Trump vetoed the stimulus bills? They blamed him for every life lost anyway. They were completely manic and apoplectic. They just, all of their angst and anger and vitriol. I mean, I was getting text messages, "You're voting for Trump. Ah, oh my God." It's like, well, more people ended up losing their life with Biden in his first year in office without any of the vitriol or venom from Democrats. Anyway, let's continue. We know how that goes.
Was really what unleashed the inflation. The good news is the inflation rate is coming down, but as you guys report all the time correctly, that 20% increase in prices is baked in the cake. So we'd have to have negative inflation to bring the prices down to where they were when Trump left office.
And a lot of people hoping for that. When asking Kamala Harris what her exact plan is to reduce prices for people at home, here's what she had to say.
We have to understand what that means. That's about the cost of living going up. That's about having to stress and stretch limited resources. That's about a source of stress for families that is not only economic, but is on a daily level, something that is a heavy weight to carry. So it is something that we take very seriously.
Let me go ahead, American people, and explain what I'm going to do to help with inflation. Inflation is about stretching the money, your money. It's about a lot of economic suffering because you're stretching the money to buy things. Those things are more expensive than they were. You see, inflation is like when they're more expensive now, they were less expensive before. And that's why Trump is bad.
But I didn't hear a plan or a policy or anything that'll tell me what happens day one to bring down the cost of my gas and my groceries. Are you worried that there isn't a real plan?
When I listen to a quote like that, it makes me awfully worried. I mean, that was just a word salad that didn't make any sense. But look, it's pretty critical that we at least stabilize prices. And the best way of doing that is to control, number one, is to get control of government spending and debt, which Kamala wants to do exactly the opposite. I count about $3 trillion of new spending that she and Tim Walz want to do. And the second thing you need to do is what, the previous economist was talking about producing more energy. We could easily bring down the price of energy to what it was. We could reduce gas prices by $1 a gallon. We could reduce people's energy bills, their electricity bills, and that reverberates throughout the economy. So that's the way to do it. But the other thing is, they do have a plan that Biden and Harris have been talking about, and that is price controls. And we tried that in the 1970s, and it was a complete failure. I mean, the one thing that all economists agree on is that price controls are a terrible way to control inflation because all you do is create scarcity of goods and services. So that's their plan. Go back to a failed model of the 70s.
Steve, you've called Kamala Harris the most anti-business presidential candidate in your lifetime. Now, you're not that old of a guy, but that.
So we're going into October. Let's say Harris is up by 2-3 points, okay? It doesn't matter if we, have a fraction of a percent less inflation and the CPI, or there's, somewhat better earnings than we thought for a major company. Everything's overvalued. Everything is very much overvalued. We're on the brink of a recession. We had a recession technically in 2022. The economy is not functioning correctly. A growing economy that's doing very well doesn't have the Fed funds rate at 5.25 or 5.5%. A functioning economy doesn't have high interest rates. And a functioning economy doesn't have 4% inflation and growing. And so a functioning economy doesn't have record highs in credit card debt and cryptocurrencies at record highs. And the reason I say that is because there are a lot of FTX, Sam Bankman-Fried type of Ponzi schemes out there. You don't have to be a genius to know that. So it's like there are so many catalysts for a terrible market crash. If it happens after November and Harris wins, it could be, Lord knows what happens to the country. Again, Lord knows. If you vote Democrat again, you're saying you have no problem with the inflation. Okay, you blame people who didn't vote for Trump because they blame Trump for everything under the sun. We had a great economy, less than 2% inflation. People are doing very well. Democrats shut down economic activity. His last year in office, there was complete hysteria in media as usual. And the people who look at media and say this is reality say, "Oh my God, Trump is horrible." The reality is Trump was a great president. He really was. He was the best president of my lifetime if you just look at the economy and foreign policy. Foreign policy is an unmitigated disaster. I'm not even getting to that now. Okay? But if you vote for Harris and then there's an economic crash, it's like, or there's an economic crash before Harris, you still vote. It's like, I don't know what to say. God bless you.
That's still a long time. What are you most worried about? What are you most worried about with her when it comes to anti-business policy?
Well, I actually amended that statement to say that, because I said that before she picked Tim Walz as her vice presidential candidate. So this is by far and away the most, because there's no balance in this. These are just two very left-winger candidates. But look, one of the problems is very simple. Neither of these two candidates, neither Kamala nor Tim Walz, have any business experience at all. They've never worked for a business. They've either been in government or in academia or in law firms their whole life. Yeah. So that's a big problem. I mean, you should have somebody who knows something about business. And I'm not saying they didn't start a business. Of course they didn't do that. They've never even worked for a business.
Yeah. You bring up a great point, and Steve, I urge everybody to read the Wall Street Journal editorial board piece that looks into his
really
his state's economic history with him at the helm. It talks about his tax policy, talks about how he dealt with the labor market, all failures. He pushed people out of the state, the most high-income earners. That's what we can have on a national scale. I urge people to read that. Great to see you. Thank you.
So we're talking about a recession.
Wall Street saw its worst day.
So as the vice president who's running for the Democratic Party would say, a recession is two really bad quarters. So bad that the growth is negative. What does negative growth mean? People lose their jobs. What does that mean? That means that you can't have food. What does that mean? That means you can't eat. Well, if you can't eat, if you don't have a job, you don't have food, you can't eat, then you can't live. If you can't live, that's bad. Trump, authoritarian, vote Democrat.
Since 2022, this past Monday in a global market rout. Some of the losses were recouped as the week moved on, but many are wondering what comes next. So joining me now, Robert Wolf, a former economic advisor to President Obama and a Fox News contributor, and E.J. Antoni, public finance economist with the Heritage Foundation. Welcome to both of you. Glad to have you with us. Let's talk about what the data says this week about what we saw. I want to start with this from USA Today. USA employers added just 114,000 jobs last month, well below expectations for 175,000 gains. Unemployment rose 4.1% up to 4.3%. That's the highest in nearly 3 years.
So you're going into November with unemployment rising, jobs lower than expected, unemployment rising, inflation increasing, interest rates still high, and then they want to lower interest rates, which will then skyrocket inflation. Why do you think the Fed didn't lower interest rates? Because they were worried about inflation. And then we have everything else going on in the world today with, catastrophe after catastrophe. Then we have record highs in credit card debt, fueling consumer spending. All of these numbers are like a facade. The aggregate numbers, you could say, if the rebuttal is, well, corporate earnings are good, well, okay, but you saw what took place with Amazon, Nvidia, all of these companies, Walmart, McDonald's. It's slowing down. So the market looks a year in advance, or half a year, 2 years in advance, and says, well, we're going to judge these stock prices on what we think future earnings will be. But future earnings might tank. If there's a recession, all the earnings tank, and then the stock market tanks either before the recession or after or causes the recession. So, I mean, how is this good? Why would you not vote for Trump? I don't get it.
To 4.3, that's the highest in nearly 3 years. They go on to say that one gauge tracking the rise of unemployment signals the U.S. could already be in a recession. Hiring is dipped below pre-COVID levels. Meanwhile, manufacturing activity shrank in July, falling to an 8-month low. Consumer spending, the economy's main engine, is slowing, and credit card debt is at a record high. Robert, that does not sound like a good collection.
So the Supreme Court, with the immunity ruling, forced the special counsel to basically end its case against Trump. They have to rewrite the indictment now. There's not going to be a trial before November, and the classified data case has been thrown out. That's the second special counsel case. The special counsel will dissolve. Trump will dissolve it and do away with it when he becomes president. Special counsel is part of the executive branch. I believe Trump will win, and you cannot accuse Trump of committing a criminal act because he allegedly lied in a speech, which he didn't. But even if you believe he did, that's not a criminal act. They tried to criminalize things that are official acts. It is, of course, not an official act to end someone's life. So any pundit telling you that knows nothing about law or politics and is being completely disingenuous, deceitful, borderline evil, actually. Everyone knows that Trump does not have the right. Nobody has the right to end another opponent's life. Trump just, by the way, survived an attempt on his life. So it's unbelievable. Anyway, and so the reason I focus on the economy is that's really what's going to the Supreme Court victories Trump is gaining, but that's what's really going to give him even further legal victories. The judge in New York might recuse. That's his decision. Likely will be linked directly to the eventual stock market crash or decline in the economy, which will very likely take place before November 5th, especially if they keep saying Harris is up in the polls. The Wall Street is petrified of that.
Of information.
Well, Shannon, thanks for having me on, and I know we're going to discuss a lot of those points. I would probably flip it completely. We've had 43 consecutive months of jobs growth. And to be clear, over the last 2 years, the Trump team and even EJ from the Heritage Foundation was working on Project 2025, and now they're sprinting away from it.
Job growth, all those quarters, how many quarters where real wages were up? Real wages were down most of that time period. Wages just recently caught up to inflation.
The Biden-Harris administration, as you know, they passed the infrastructure policy. And look what we've done. We've had manufacturing gains, almost 800,000, big private sector investment, and factory construction at record highs. And don't take my word Just look at the projects: the Arizona chips plant, the Georgia battery plant, the North Carolina semiconductor plant, Wisconsin data center. Yes, last month was below expectations.
Well, there are a bunch of tech is getting pummeled in terms of earnings, but let's continue.
But we've had 14 million job gains since this president has been in office, and we also,
most of which came after the shutdowns were ended by blue state governors who, coincidentally ended all of their attempts at shutting down the economy right when a Democrat was nominated or, appointed into the Oval Office.
also know that we've had better GDP. We've had better economic policy. And yes, inflation has been a long tail problem for the country, but that's a global phenomenon, both on agriculture and energy.
Let me bring EJ in here. So I know it's something we talk about a lot, 14 million jobs. We know a lot of that was rebound, jobs added back from the COVID pandemic. But what do you make of what Robert says about your work and about, a view that is somewhat more pessimistic being inaccurate when it comes to our economy?
Well, I'm certainly very proud of the work we've done on Project 2020.
He mentioned the CHIPS Act. Well, that's also, Democrats were very worried about what's taking place in Taiwan, in large part because all of the a possible invasion or a possible military quagmire there. Okay. We didn't have that with Trump. We weren't talking about Taiwan possibly getting invaded. I mean, there was always the possibility, but that talk and rhetoric, all of the military drills have increased in regularity when Biden took over. And then you have NVIDIA earnings tanking. That company is in free fall now. And let's continue.
We've made a lot of really great conservative recommendations for the next administration, whoever it may be, and we hope they take us up on it. But in terms of the job market, one of the things we have to remember is although we continue to see payrolls rising, the number of people actually employed has been falling. It's actually 600,000 below where it was back in November of last year. So the labor market is not all well, certainly not as well as it seems, I would say. Yes, we are seeing unemployment tick up. We're seeing literally all of the net job gains from the last year not go to native-born Americans, but going to foreign-born workers. That's a trend that has actually been going on for the last several years. And in terms of GDP, yes, it's true GDP is growing, but it's essentially growing because of government debt. Under the Biden-Harris administration, we've increased debt by about $7.2 trillion. The Treasury has drawn down its cash.
You see, well, it's a growing economy. Well, how much of that economy is government spending and how many of the jobs are actually going to Americans? So, I mean, Democrats live with aggregate numbers. It takes a second to look and slice and dice the aggregate numbers saying, yeah, that's not true. See, again, Mark Twain, the famous quote, if you lie with statistics, could you then be indicted and imprisoned, which is what they tried to do with Trump. They said Trump lied, and he lied and tried to deceive the American people. And so how many times has Biden deceived? Biden was deceiving the American people for 3 weeks before he was ousted. He said, no, I'm not leaving, man. Come on, man. I'm not leaving, man. And then he left. Was he lying? Could you imprison him for actually stepping down? Was that also a violation of 18 U.S. Code 371? So that's why they have to rewrite the indictment. But let's continue.
Cash balance about another trillion, so that's about 8.2 trillion in the red. And what did we get for it? About 6.6 trillion in GDP growth, down to 2.2 if you adjust for inflation. Essentially, it's a debt-fueled spending binge that gave us 40-year high inflation, record high credit card interest rates, and a tripling of mortgage rates.
How does that end?
Not well. We can look back at different points in our history when we did essentially the exact same thing. The 1970s, unfortunately, was a very...
By the way, mark my words, when there's a huge market crash, they will blame Trump, and people will believe it. The same people voting for Harris, the wonderful, highly educated, morally superior liberal Democrats who didn't vote for Harris before in the primary for some reason, but now suddenly they love Harris, will blame Trump and Republicans for lack of regulation. All the mismanagement and that led to a bubble getting burst. That's, it'll all be Trump's fault. Literally at the very end of Biden's tenure.
Very good example of this. And the result was back-to-back recessions and mortgage rates that eventually hit 20%.
All right, Robert, we're going to get a lot of economic data this week. CPI inflation coming out Wednesday, retail sales Thursday. Friday, we'll get that University of Michigan consumer sentiment survey as well. What are you going to look to tell you where we're moving forward?
I mean, listen, we saw the stock market get hit and the world was concerned. But, in 1987, I was at Salomon Brothers. We saw the Black Monday crash, and you saw what happened the last few days. One, the stock market came back. And we should be clear, that was a 1,000-point swing, and it was a big swing. We had 2,000-point downturns under President Trump, the three largest in history. I would also
if he's referring to his last year in office, that was because Democrats shut down economic activity gleefully. And they didn't have to do that. Okay, then they say, well, bureaucrats and global multilateral and multinational organizations said do so. So what? That's what's so great about Trump. If it doesn't make sense, he's like, nah, I'm not going to do it. Democrats will. It's like if you vote for Harris or any Democrat now, you're actually voting for an entire public relations, political, media monstrosity machine. I mean, it's the only person who will tell multinational or multilateral organizations, nah, we're not going to do that, is Trump. If they say, hey, you should shut down your economy again, Democrats will say, okay, let's print more money. Let's continue.
Also say the idea that the Heritage Foundation is also fiscal conservatives all of a sudden. I mean, come on, that's complete BS. They were touting
more so than Democrats. So because the Heritage Foundation is not as fiscally conservative, let's say, as they claim, that means that Democrats are fiscal conservatives. They spend trillions upon trillions, more than Trump would or any Heritage Foundation person would.
The Trump tax cuts and that it was going to pay for itself with 5% GDP. My buddy Steve Moore couldn't wait to talk about it paying for himself.
We had record low poverty. The Trump tax cuts worked. We had record low poverty. I thought Democrats cared about poverty. We also had record highs in household median income. We had inflation less than 2%. And we had interest rates that were, like a fraction, a tiny, tiny fraction of what they are now, less than 0.5%, or no, less than 1%, a fraction of 1%. And so you can get a mortgage for half the monthly payment. With mortgage rates were like 3% in 2018. They're now close to 7%.
They had $8 trillion in debt in a 4-year period, the most in the history of a president.
Again, adding Trump's numbers, adding his aggregate numbers and ignoring the fact that Democrats shut down economic activity is not fair. It's incorrect. It's misleading. It is not fair. And it does not give the truth. The truth is that we had a great economy. The tax cuts worked, and the tax cuts spent less. If you want to say they impacted the debt and deficit, not as much as Build Back Better and everything else, the Inflation Reduction Act, which actually inflation's going up. All the bills that Biden passed were far more costly than anything Trump did. That's a fact. And if you say, well, his last year in office, what was he supposed to do? It was Democrats Democrats prevented people from working in Trump's last year in office. We went from record low unemployment to like record highs in unemployment in 3 months. What was he supposed to do? And then they say, well, Trump spent a lot. Trump's increased the debt. Democratic governors increased the debt, not Trump.
From 20 to 28 trillion, and the deficit ballooned. So this idea that all of a sudden Heritage is worried about fiscal conservatism, we should just reflect on what really happened during the Trump administration.
Okay, and very quickly, EJ, want to give you a response to that because it came up with our last guest too, that these tax cuts under President Trump benefited the wealthy and they haven't been good for the country.
Well, it's interesting because all of the different news organizations that did an analysis on the Trump tax reform found that middle-class Americans had a lower tax burden after the reform was passed, not more. And in terms of the very wealthy, especially in high-tax states like New York, New Jersey, Illinois, California, those individuals actually paid more because although their top marginal tax rate was reduced, they lost deductions under that tax reform. In other words, it got rid of tax loopholes. And apparently the Democrats now want to get rid of that because doing so would be a handout to their donor base, again, in those high tax blue states.
All right, I feel like I could do an hour with you two in this conversation.
So, ladies and gentlemen, the stock market, the economy, and the Supreme Court verdicts and rulings and decisions, they've all become one. Okay, it's basically the three things from now until November 5th. They won't be polls, it won't be debates, because what'll happen is if they still keep Harris, which I've heard rumblings of, you got to believe there's another, woman in the Democratic Party, Hillary, who is looking and saying, gee, how can I, if it was so easy to oust Biden, a sitting president, maybe there's somebody else who wants a chance. But again, let's say they keep Harris. Okay, you never know with Democrats. If you think that's an outlandish thought, Democrats they can switch candidates 15 times over from now until November, and every single time, all of media will say, this is amazing, this person's amazing, oh, it's a phenomenon. So, but anyway, from here on out, Supreme Court, stock market, the economy, and of course, and then the fourth thing, foreign policy. Okay? Forget the polls. Trump's going to win. He will win. It's just getting there getting to the point where the average viewer of CNN and MSNBC say, oh my God, maybe Trump is better for the economy. That is going to hurt in terms of finance. But anyway, hit subscribe to this channel, people, because there will be a crash, unfortunately. Hit subscribe. Thank you so very, very much. God bless you all. I'll be back tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.